I'm talking to you about Indira Gandhi, the imposition of emergency, and the legacy that emergency has left behind for Indian democracy. Now, this is the era of what we call elected autocrats or elected authoritarian leaders. That is, leaders who have come through the democratic process, who are armed with mighty mandates, but are using those mandates to turn their back on democracy. You see, in the 1930s, the enemy of democracy was supposed to be communism. In the 1940s, the enemy of democracy was supposed to be fascism. Today, it is as if the enemy of democracy is democracy. Because leaders who have come through the democratic process are using their democratic power to misuse state agencies and to misuse state instruments and override democratic institutions. They're undermining democratic institutions, muzzling the opposition, and muzzling the press. So, elections may be happening, but democracy is not keeping pace with elections. So, we have lots and lots of elections, less and less democracy. Now, the first elected authoritarian in India was, in my opinion, Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was an incredibly complex figure. She was someone who was the daughter of the great Democrat Jawaharlal Nehru. She grew up surrounded by the men and women of destiny in the broad environment of the Indian national movement. She was born into the fires of a nation about to be born, but she went out in the fiery blaze of a nation at war with itself. And it was a war that she herself created. She was a charming person in her own personal life. She was a very aristocratic woman. She had tremendous tastes. She had a great deal of interest in the arts. She was tremendously gifted when it came to artistic endeavors in finding, artifacts and crafts and saris and the whole tradition of the Indian arts. She was tremendously interested in Indian arts, tremendously interested in Indian wildlife, tremendously interested in nature conservation, Project Tiger, space exploration. There was a lot that happened in her time. But apart from all of this, Indira Gandhi was a ruthless politician. And not only was she a ruthless politician, she believed in using the agencies of state to muzzle her political opponents, in using state power to fight a political war. Now, this is something that Democrats must guard against. You see, you can't use the levers of state. You can't use the Enforcement Directorate or the CBI or the Parliament or the civil service. You can't use the massive power of state office against political opponents, because then you are undermining the state. You are undermining democratic processes. So, if you undermine the judiciary, if you undermine the press, if you undermine the civil service, and you make it all hostage to your tremendous political power, and you use all these state agencies to fight your political opponent, then you are destroying democracy and destroying democratic function. Now, Indira Gandhi was a populist, she was a nationalist, she was a great patriot. And after the 1971 Bangladesh war, she was at the very height of her popularity. It was a kind of popularity unseen in India. She had, as the head of India, as a Prime Minister of India, she had scored a decisive victory over Pakistan. The only Indian Prime Minister to have won a decisive victory over Pakistan, the national enemy, and dismembered Pakistan. She invaded East Pakistan and she split East Pakistan and West Pakistan, created the birth of Bangladesh. And after the 71 war, Indira Gandhi was at the height of her powers. Vajpayee, then an opposition leader in parliament, called her Abhinav Chandi Durga. She was Ma Durga. She was Shakti. She was the heroine of the Bangladesh war, and universally hailed in India and across the world. The Economist magazine at that time called her the Empress of India. In the 1972 elections, Congress swept the assembly polls, and she was at the very height of her power. But somehow, within the seeds of this tremendous victory, there were also trends of failure and defeat. It was as if failure was built into this tremendous success. Because right after the 1972 elections, when the Congress swept the assembly polls, there were the oil shocks. There was tremendous economic dislocation. Prices began to rise. Uh, Joblessness was rampant. You had the Navnirman movement starting in Gujarat. You had student protests in the street. You had student protests in Bihar. You had the coming of Jayaprakash Narayan, who led the protest movements against Indira Gandhi. There was tremendous dissatisfaction. The heavy hand of state power was being used to crush protests, and that was leading to even more protests on the street, even more student agitations. As you know, the big leaders of today, many of the big BJP leaders of today, were all participants in the Navnirman agitation in Gujarat in the 1970s. And then, of course, in 1975 came the elections in Gujarat, where the Congress was defeated. And not only was the Congress defeated in elections in Gujarat, but also Indira Gandhi suffered the tremendous legislative setback where in the Allahabad High Court judgment pronounced that her membership to the Lok Sabha was disqualified because of campaign irregularities in the 1971 elections. So her membership was disqualified. Now, that, as you know, these were the trigger points for the declaration of emergency on 25th June 1975. Now, what happened with the declaration of emergency? The Republic of India passed into a state of emergency. As a result, democratic norms and procedures were undermined. At the very top, the position of the president was undermined. As you know, the famous cartoon of Abu Abraham with Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, the then president, signing the emergency proclamation in his bathtub, where even the president was reduced to a rubber stamp, to an enormously powerful political executive. Journalists were imprisoned. 253 journalists were taken into custody. The opposition was muzzled. Opposition leaders were jailed. Judges were superseded in the Supreme Court. Certain laws were passed by which fundamental rights were suspended. The so-called Indira revolution was about taking over the levers of power and instituting a kind of a elected autocracy. She was by then elected, but she had become the great dictator. Now, the legacy, of course, what happened is that she then withdrew the emergency. In 1977, the emergency lasted 18 months, and Indira Gandhi withdrew the emergency in 1977. She held elections. She was defeated in those elections. She accepted the verdict and she resigned. Now, that, in a sense, I think is a sign of hope, because in spite of the fact that she created the emergency, in spite of the fact that she imposed the emergency, Indira Gandhi did lift the emergency after 18 months. She did declare elections. She accepted the verdict. You know, that's a very important point we have to realize, that she accepted the verdict. She need not have. She could have just said, countermanded the verdict and continued as Prime Minister and abolished and had a new Constituent Assembly and created a presidential form of government. This was a demand at the time. A number of Congress leaders were saying that, why have elections? Just forget about elections, make yourself president for life. That could have happened, but she didn't do that. She actually did hold elections. She accepted the verdict of the 1977 elections and she resigned. But what happened as a result of the emergency was that a legacy was created by which a tremendously powerful political executive, a tremendously powerful political leader could subordinate all aspects of democracy to herself. So, when a political leader became so strong that the judiciary, the media, the civil service, the parliament, everything else became subordinate to this one political leader. And that is what created this elected authoritarianism. And that is the legacy of the emergency, that the political leader today, the politician, if he or she has a massive mandate, can literally override all the very important checks that exist on rampant political power in our constitution. Now, our constitution founders were very skeptical of political power. They had achieved political swaraj, they had achieved political independence, but they were skeptical of the politicians' lust for power, for the politicians' drive for power. And so, therefore, they put in all these checks to political power. Against political power, they raised the judiciary. Against political power, they gave the freedom of speech to the press. Against political power, they gave the autonomous institutions like the election commission, like the role of the president. But what happened with the Indira revolution was that all these checks and balances were simply rubbed out because she rubbed them out by diktat using her own enormous mandate and the enormous popularity that she had at that time with the people. So she used her popularity, used her democratic mandate to crush democratic institutions and democratic norms. And that is happening till today.